Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is Dr. David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database, and I author the weekly school shooting data analysis and reports Substack. For the episode today, we're going to talk about a topic that really dovetails with a previous conversation that I had with Dr. Jens Ludwig at University of Chicago and his best-selling book this year, Unforgiving Places, which was looking at the characteristics of gun violence over the last 5 decades in Chicago. So the paper today is a much more micro look at gun violence that is specific to schools. So this paper is Are School Shootings a Unique Form of Violence? A comparison of the individual and contextual correlates of non-fatal school shootings and youth gun violence. And with me today is Kyle Knapp, who's the primary author of this paper, with his dissertation chair, Dr. Emma Friedel. They are both at Florida State University, nearby me, in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into this paper, criminology and criminal justice are usually departments that somebody who's interested in policing seeks out, and the people that have masters or PhDs in criminology and criminal justice are often career police officers who are using that either to advance up to the chief's ranks or to then go into academia and teaching once they retire. But there are also people that are not police officers who end up in these programs. And I'm always interested to see what about criminology and criminal justice really interested you, and how did you get here?
Yeah, definitely. I have a bit of a strange path kind of into this field. So, I mean, when I was like 14 years old, I got really interested in crime and violence, and I was watching shows like NCIS, Bones, and I thought I wanted to be a forensic scientist. That was kind of my main interest. But I'm very squeamish. Like I don't like blood, I don't like flesh, or so. And so I went to undergrad actually with forensic anthropology in mind. I went to Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm from northern Wisconsin. I'm actually in Wisconsin right now. And so when I first started undergrad, my majors were anthropology and forensic science, and I focused more on like sociocultural anthropology, so ethnography, as well as helping out on investigations of human skeletal remains in Minnesota. And so I really started there, and then I worked on a forensic case that I don't think I can say much about still. This would have been in maybe 2015 or 16, but it was an intimate partner homicide case that was somewhat high profile in Minnesota, a cold case. And after working on that case where we went out in the field and we were looking for human remains, I started to think about violence in kind of a different way. Previously, I'd always thought of it through the lens of forensic science, more of an investigative lens, like something bad happens, and then I would show up with my professor at the time, and we would try to figure out what happened, try to find the remains, and then kind of give the remains either their identity back or assist with like prosecuting an offender. After I worked on that intimate partner homicide case, I was kind of like, okay, there were all these, when we were briefed on it, there were all these kind of red flags and things that people knew about. This person's friends knew that they were having marital issues. And so I started to get interested in prevention. Following that, I took a forensic psychology course at Hamline taught by Dr. Jillian Peterson. And
one of my research collaborators.
Yep. Yeah, I heard about that. Yep. And so when I took her course, I was like, okay, wow, this is really interesting. And I'd always been interested in like serial killers and stuff, but I'd always been told you can't really make a career out of studying them because there's so few profilers and that sort of thing. And so, but it kind of piqued my interest. And one of the books that she had assigned in that class, we had to pick like one of a number of books. And I picked Peter Langman's book on school shootings. And so I wrote like a little review of it or something. And then The following year, I added criminology as a major then because I was like, okay, I have some extra time. I had some space in my schedule. So I added criminology as a second major. Um, and then it was a year or two later, uh, Jill had sent out an email basically asking like, hey, I'm going to start developing a mass shooting database. And at that time it was, I don't have any money and looking for student volunteers. I was going into my senior year of undergrad, and I wanted research experience because I knew I was going to graduate school. I just didn't know at that time it was going to be criminology. And so I volunteered to work on her database, helped with that. She and James Densley got a grant, continued to work on it. And then I worked on it for a year or two after I graduated, before I went to graduate school. But through doing that, I got really interested in mass violence. I got interested in, how can people do these awful things, right? And so at the time, and I think still presently, anthropology isn't necessarily thinking about violence in that way. It's either the forensic context or it's looking at like warfare, genocide, more like it just views it in kind of a different lens. And so I kind of moved over into criminology because I was interested more in the interpersonal violence, and studying mass violence, and more, I guess, through a sociological lens, I would say. Um, and I find criminology to be an attractive discipline because I view it as interdisciplinary, right? It's kind of the intersection of anthropology, sociology, psychology, political science. It can be, right, statistics, AI. Um, and so for me, it was kind of the perfect field to study violence in the way that I wanted to approach it. Um, so then when I was looking at graduate schools, I was applying to schools where there were people who were studying school shootings, mass shootings, gun violence, um, and ended up at Florida State University. And then right off the bat, started working with Dr. Emma Friedel, who was an incoming professor at the time. And so, yeah, kept going, kept reading, and then I'm still here.
Well, it's such a small world. I'm a advisory board member of the Violence Prevention
Mm-hmm.
Project at Hamline University. So I actually just saw Dr. Peterson and Dr. Densley
Mm-hmm.
a couple weeks ago as we were talking about and working on some projects. But what's interesting is that we kind of have a similar academic trajectory there as well, where
Mm-hmm.
when I created this school shooting database, it was an attempt to understand the deliberately planned mass attacks like Parkland and Uvalde and Sandy Hook. But it turned into 99% of the data collection is about this systemic gun violence that happens at
Mm-hmm.
schools. It's fights that escalate into shootings, the majority of which are either at dismissal or sporting events. And it's robberies and drug related shootings, domestic violence, accidents, suicides, all of these different things that happen within the broader community and our most common types of kind of community gun violence are also happening at schools. And they happen at a much higher frequency than your deliberately planned attacks. And I think that's because a school is just a microcosm of its community. Everything that's going on in that community is going to be the types of things that are going to happen on a campus that's a hub of that community. And I think that that kind of gets into your paper, on looking at the unique forms of gun violence at schools or violence at schools. Where did the idea for this paper and your research question come from?
Yeah, it's interesting because it came about a while ago, so I have to kind of dig through my memory there. But at the time, I was taking a victimology course at the graduate level at FSU, and taught by Dr. Jillian Taranovic. And when I was taking that course, I was already thinking kind of about victim and offender characteristics, incident characteristics, victimization. That was kind of floating around in my head. At the same time, I was doing just reading on the side of school shooting research, mass shooting research, trying to get kind of caught up in the literature, um, or trying to have more of an expansive knowledge. And I've always been interested, ever since I started working with the Violence Project in undergrad. on the causes and correlates of mass shootings and school shootings. But one thing that I noticed in grad school is, there's no scholarly consensus. Anyone who does this work knows there's no universal agreement on what constitutes a school shooting. Is it someone brandishing a gun? Is it someone being, shot? Is it someone being killed? Or is it multiple people being killed? And so I started to think of like, okay, what are the different consequences of these definitions? Or, there's heterogeneity. We kind of know that, and kind of what's going on there. And so I had spoken with Dr. Taranovic and then Dr. Friedel about, the uniqueness of school gun violence. Like, we know rampage school shootings are somewhat unique, or they're treated as unique, right? The disgruntled middle-class white boy who typically, injures and kills multiple classmates or teachers. But what about more common, less severe forms of school gun violence? And so through those conversations, that's how this paper was kind of grew, was let's compare school shootings to shootings that happen in a community context, the more like street shootings, and just see if there are similarities or differences in terms of victim, offender, incident, and contextual characteristics. So that's kind of how we arrived there. It happened pretty quick, actually. It wasn't, this wasn't something that I kind of thought about for several years. It actually was something that happened pretty quickly, and then started cleaning data and was kind of off to the races. So, but yeah.
So once you kind of established that your research question was going to be, what are the different characteristics of shootings that are taking place on school campuses? The K through 12 school shooting database is my effort to try to collect every single instance of a gun being fired. A small percentage of those are cases where a gun is brandished. And that was because in the 1970s and 1980s, hostage taking was a much more significant thing at banks, at public places, on airplanes, but it was also happening at schools. And there were these multi-hour hostage standoffs where an armed person or multiple armed people held a classroom hostage, but they were successfully negotiated. Well, if a shot's never fired, what do you really do with that kind of incident? So those were all of these things that I didn't know how to grapple with. So I just decided I'll make as many categories as possible. I'll make as many variables as possible, and I'll just collect all the incidents and let other people sort them. You also looked at a couple other data sources. So how did you ultimately arrive at the data that you needed to analyze for this paper?
Definitely, yeah. And as you know too, there's many school shooting databases that are run by news organizations, nonprofits. And so I think sometimes if someone if there's anyone watching who wants to do this kind of research, it can be somewhat overwhelming of like, what data source do I use? The way to us, the data source was really driven by our research questions. So we wanted to compare shootings at schools to shootings in the community. And we wanted it to be a somewhat clean comparison. So we were looking for a data set that had both. And so often school shooting databases don't necessarily collect information on gang violence on the streets, right? And so NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, published by the FBI, that data source was advantageous because we were able to do direct comparisons between school shootings or school gun violence and gun violence in the community, and have the variables be the same and the same time period. And so that's why we ultimately chose NIBRS. It's a bit of an like non-traditional way to examine school shootings. But again, we wanted to do those comparisons, and the other databases, they all have utility, right? They all have, especially the broader ones, I think are interesting because you get more of the scope, right, of school gun violence. And so our database, right, we define a school shooting as aggravated assault with a firearm that occurs on school campus. So our data is tapping into a lot of the incidents that you have also collected, right, of brandishing or unsuccessful shootings. So yeah, that's kind of the nature of why we chose that, the nature of our sample, um, how we arrived at it.
Yeah, and for people that want more background on either of those, in the show notes, I'll put two links to other academic papers. One is exploring the definitional differences with school shootings and mass shootings. So it's an entire paper just breaking down all of the different definitions and then what the implications are of those different definitions. And there's also a paper on uh, creating categories for the types of gun violence that happen on school campuses. And this is a broader community problem. And there's also a third link I'll drop in on a recent study of exposure on the walking routes to and from school
Mm-hmm.
for gun violence within communities in Chicago. So these are very complicated definitional questions and data questions to unpack. And there are lots of people thinking about these things because we don't really have clean ways to categorize them.
Mm-hmm.
So once you had your data source, what types of research methods did you kind of apply to this to start taking that data to answer your questions?
Yeah, definitely. Our data use or our paper uses a multi-level logistic regression, and so um, basically the way that we had thought through this was in order to do this comparison, right? You could do this comparison in different ways. We were thinking, okay, let's make our dependent variable essentially is a shooting. Does it occur in a public context or does it occur in a school? So 0, 1, right? And then we used a logistic regression to essentially, right, compare those two categories to each other. And so again, it's a direct comparison. And then we set it up where the victim and offender information was aggregated to the incident level, right? So we have like, for example, um, rather than doing like number of male victims, number of female victims, we had operationalized like victim sex as is it all males in the incident or at least one female? So we had to do some aggregation there to make it cleaner. Um, and then we added in contextual variables, right? The correlates from the social disorganization literature. And so that was to see, we can compare victims and offenders, but also what kinds of places are these happening in, right? Are these happening in relatively disadvantaged neighborhoods, or are they happening in more economically advantaged neighborhoods? And part of our reasoning for that, to add that extra layer of complexity to the study, was there's this fundamental assumption in the literature and um, kind of among the public, right, that mass school shootings at least occur in suburban areas or more advantaged areas. And while I think academics know, right, are aware of the fact that there's school gun violence in urban communities, the rampage school shootings have kind of been symbolized with school gun violence broadly, even though while they're very, very horrible, right, they're tragedies, they deserve attention and study. They are quite rare. They have a very low base rate, and so we were kind of thinking, let's assess that assumption as well, um, and have this study be somewhat a little bit more holistic than just looking at individual level characteristics. Let's add that contextual layer. And then we also control for like gun availability using CDC data, using a gun ownership proxy. And yeah, I'll wait to kind of get into the findings, but that's kind of how we set it up. So we had, I think we had a basically incident level, incidents nested within counties, nested within states. That was the setup of our analysis.
And I think for non-academic listeners, you might hear, logistic regression or control variables and other things, and you might think like, oh, what's the purpose of that? That's just the stats jockeys, making numbers come out the way that they want them to come out. But can you just briefly explain like why you would take these different quantifiable variables and then what creating your regression model and having two different sets of models with your incident-based school shooting incidents and then also your community incidents, like why that's kind of a clean way uh, to quantify and analyze that data.
Yeah, definitely. So, with logistic regression, we can compare basically the 0 category to the 1 category. So in our case, the 0 was public shootings. That was kind of our like reference category. And then school shootings were our 1 category. And so when we add these variables in, like offender sex, offender age, offender race, victim characteristics, whether there was an argument, whether there was gang involvement, when we add these other correlates or these other variables in the regression, it's directly comparing the school shooting to the public shooting on these different measures. And then we get a coefficient, in this case, an odds ratio. And then that tells us, for example, if there's at least, or if the victim composition is all male, the odds of it being a school shooting relative to a public shooting is, like 30% higher or something like that. I'm making that up. That's not exactly what it was in the paper, but that's kind of how that clean comparison is happening, where it's not necessarily that it's telling us what is more likely to be, what characteristics are more likely to happen in a school shooting versus a public shooting. And that helps us, I think, understand the differences more, right? What is differentiating these two shootings from each other in terms of these characteristics? But you could do the comparison in a number of different ways. You could do descriptive statistics and t-tests and chi-square. We were interested in doing it kind of all in one model, and doing it using regression, just because I think that the interpretation is a little bit more fine-grained in some ways. Did that answer your question? I felt like I was getting a little rambly, so.
No, I think that does, because
Okay.
we have to remember that these terms make sense to us,
Right.
but there are a lot of folks who are the kind of operational end
Mhm.
users, who are police officers or school officials or teachers or parents, who listen to this show.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to give the background to understand, why these numbers matter.
Mhm.
Because if it's a complicated term, then you're going to think, oh, well, I don't really understand that term, so I don't really understand what the findings mean. In the show
Mhm.
notes, I'm going to include table 1, which is the summary of this 3-level logistic regression model. And within this table, it breaks down characteristics like the offender age, the offender race, the victim's age, the victim's race. Was the victim female? Was there a single offender, multiple offenders? Was it an argument? And then in this table, you have your results for model 1 and you have your results for model 2. And in most cases, the numbers within the table are very close to each other, and they have a bunch of
Mhm.
asterisks next to each other.
Mhm.
What does that mean? What does that tell us?
Yeah, so when you do a multi-level modeling, which I won't get all into because that's a whole other kind of ball game. Typically, or at least the way that I was taught to do it, is that when you have multiple levels or different, kind of units that are nested within each other, like individuals and incidents or incidents and counties, um, model 1 is looking at just the incident level, but it's still controlling for the nesting structure of the incidents in the counties and the states. So if there is clustering, and if that's kind of doing anything to the um, to the standard errors of the model, it's still accounting for that. And then what you do is you like step in your next set of characteristics. So then model 2 shows the county level characteristics added in. And so you'll notice that the numbers are often very similar. Um, and that's because when you add that next level, and because you're accounting for more characteristics at the county level in your model, the idea is that the coefficients on at the incident level should be, it's a fancy word, attenuated, right? They should become smaller. Something that was statistically significant, or something that we can say with some confidence that there's a relationship, that might go away. um, in this case, another thing too with doing a multi-level model is you can understand how much variation in the dependent variable is explained at each level. So basically, you know, how much are these characteristics differentiating between public shootings and school shootings at each level? The most of the variation is explained at that incident level, right? Among those characteristics, the individual level characteristics and incident characteristics. So when you add in county level factors, there isn't much of a change because they don't explain as much. And there's not a lot of significance there. And I can talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to findings. I have a kind of a concise way to summarize that, but that's essentially kind of what is going on with those data. So um, yeah, I tend to look at like model 2 when I'm talking about relationships because that has the 3 levels in there. I don't think the state level characteristics are pictured in the table because they were largely non-significant. There's another table in the appendix that has those for people that are curious.
It's worth going down kind of the academic and statistical rabbit hole on some of these things because you never know who this sparks some curiosity in, and they ultimately say, I have a master's in public policy from a number of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but I've got a lot of data from my school district, and actually there might be some ways to measure this, and that turns into a graduate project or maybe somebody's PhD or EED. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to is Star Talk with Dr. Neil
Mm-hmm.
deGrasse Tyson, and he'll have an astrophysicist on going in depth about how wormhole theory works and why we really need to say dark gravity instead of dark matter. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand half of the material, but it's the little bits of it that give you
Mm-hmm.
some curiosity where maybe you do go and write an article as I have about how the 3-body problem applies to school shooting threat assessment. So yeah, get into as much depth as you want with
Mm-hmm.
this because you never know who this is going to create some curiosity
Mm-hmm.
for. So then kind of what do these results mean based on this? Like, what are the findings?
Yeah, so the findings were very interesting to me. So kind of an overview, right? We had 752 school shootings, non-fatal school shootings that were um, in our data. And I want to specify non-fatal before I get into kind of interpreting things because with NIBRs, right, there's generalizability issues, there's coverage issues. It's not yet nationally representative. Um, in the NIBRs data, there are very few fatal school shootings that are captured. And so when I talk about these findings, we're comparing non-fatal public shootings to non-fatal school shootings. Um, and so some people might say, like, why does that matter? Because we should be interested in the fatal ones, and that's true. We should. However, we know relatively little about non-fatal gun violence, and I think your work with your database has also tried to kind of advocate for. We need to look at everything, basically, go wide, right? Look at the heterogeneity. Um, so that's my little
Well, part of that is that there's so much randomness in
right,
gun violence, and the difference between a fatal or a non-fatal shooting is often if
mm-hmm.
somebody has good aim,
Right,
uh, or if a gun malfunctioned.
mm-hmm.
So, when you need big data, when you need aggregate information that represents as many places and people and circumstances as possible to understand a problem, you want the biggest aperture possible.
Right, exactly. And then when you get into like lethality, that's a whole other ballgame because it's how quick was the response from law enforcement and EMS? How close was the nearest trauma center? Right. So there's a lot of variables that we often can't, I can't necessarily easily, or at least within the scope of this study, account for all of that. Right. So
I mean,
yeah,
there
yeah.
was a student saved during a shooting during a fight
Mm-hmm.
because the bullet that would have hit his chest deflected off of a school issued laptop.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, there's just incredible randomness in these incidents.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And that's actually for anyone who does want to I before I get into the findings, I guess I want to demystify something too. And I think you can relate to this having done research on this for many years and um sometimes I think people that are aspiring graduate students or people that want to get involved in research, they see these papers and they kind of assume that these things happen quickly. But it's like I've spent many hours, adding in the fatal cases, taking them out, running it as one level, running it as two, running it as three, looking at only counties with over 30,000 people because there might be a weird nesting thing, or the model might not converge. So all that is to say, like, the final product for most of these papers, right? The researcher has done a lot of teasing apart, adding cases and taking them out, and not in a nefarious way, but to better understand the phenomenon and kind of what that story is in the data. So I just wanted to plug that a little bit too, because I'm sure you relate. Like you do a lot of things that are kind of tweaking and looking at things from different angles before you kind of land on, here's how we're going to frame the study and do it. So it's not something that I did like on a weekend and then
Oh, yeah.
wrote
And that
over the
doesn't
course.
even account for the peer review process,
Right.
where once you do submit this to a journal, it might be 6 months before you get comments back. And then based on the comments, you might need to make some significant changes or do a different analysis or create different tables. Then you send it back and the reviewers look at it again and they reject it. So you have to find a different journal, but that journal uses a different citation format. So you change all of your citations. Maybe the word limit is 500 words shorter. So you have to, cut some paragraphs or really, really critical information. You submit that again. The reviewers' comments come back. Why didn't you explore this? And the thing you didn't explore is the 500 words you needed to cut. So needless to say, there's a reason I write on Substack primarily instead of peer-reviewed journals, because it's a pain in the butt to do, but it is an incredible accomplishment to get a paper like this out there. So what are
Right.
some of these like key findings from this?
Yeah, so the kind of big takeaways. So again, our question was, are school shootings a unique form of violence? We're looking at a form of school shooting that we have limited knowledge about. When we do the comparisons between shootings in a community context and those that happen at school, we find relatively minimal differences between the two, which is counter to the stereotype that school gun violence is represented primarily by rampage school shootings. Which again, I think many academics know this. It's more the public that often doesn't. And so when you hear a statistic like, there's 300 school shootings in a year or something like that, people think there's rampage shootings happening every day. But through our comparison, I mean, we found, non-fatal school shootings were more likely to involve younger offenders and victims. They were more likely to involve male victims without the presence of female victims, relative to having female victims in the incident. School shootings were more likely to involve lone perpetrators, right? They're not committed with friends or in a group context with co-shooters. And they were more likely to involve acquaintances, which is interesting, right? In terms of the victim-offender relationship.
But that fits with violent crime in general, right? Is strangers rarely shoot each other.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and right, that's a misconception too among the public that strangers are waiting to, right. Not that it doesn't happen, but it just happens far less than people perceive. But yeah, and then non-fatal school shootings are also less likely to involve interpersonal arguments, less likely to involve other crimes. So like you're committing a shooting and while you're robbing someone, or theft, and then a shooting happens immediately before or after. And non-fatal school shootings were less likely to be injurious, to have minor or serious injuries than public shootings. And so I say that there's minimal differences. If you look at the table, there are few asterisks, right? There's few significant differences. The way that Dr. Friedel and I kind of thought through these results, though, there are differences there. We kind of proposed that those differences are probably being shaped by the school context. So, if a shooting happens at a school, the odds are the offender and the victim are going to be younger, right? That's probably not surprising. Shootings that happen in a public context also involve adolescents, but they might be marginally older on average, right? They might be more like 17, 18, 19, 20, as opposed to, 16, 17, or 15, 16. the other interesting thing too is lone perpetrators, right? The school context might disrupt the kind of offending in groups, that group context that occurs more often in the streets, right? And that's probably due to monitoring at school, the measures that are in place for school security. I'm just kind of guessing, right?
Well, something I've found from a paper that I've had sitting in peer review for a while, but I think is finally going to make it out there, is looking at
Mhm.
125 averted school shootings.
Mm,
And with actual deliberately planned attacks at schools, there have only been three that involved multiple perpetrators.
mhm,
But in our averted school shooting sample set, about 20% of them involve multiple perpetrators. And if you
mm,
think about the pathway to avert a pre planned plot, the more people that are involved and the more people that are talking about it, the greater chance there is that a classmate is going to overhear something. And then
mhm,
that classmate is going to provide a tip, which is how more than 80% of these averted attacks were stopped. They came from a tip. So
mhm,
if you just think about, if schools do, I think, a good job of engaging students, engaging staff members in alerting them to a problem. I mean, I see a dozen Google alerts every day for students that are arrested with guns at schools because somebody gave a tip that they had the gun. They didn't plan to shoot
mhm.
anybody that day, but if they got into a fight, that fight might have turned into a shooting because they had the gun. If
Right,
you have multiple people that are kind of planning a robbery or planning to, jump somebody in the bathroom, and multiple of them have guns, there's going to be an even higher likelihood that there's some sort of uh, positive interaction that takes place to prevent that violence from happening, is my
right.
theory.
Yeah, and I think there's conversations within the school shooting literature about the code of silence. I think we've all probably read about that. People that have read into these events, right? These ideas like, oh, there's these risk factors, but people don't say things. But when you do look at averted school shootings, or you look at threats, people that just threatened a school shooting and how it was reported, you do notice. I think students are better than sometimes we give them credit for pointing out to someone like I got a weird Snapchat message or that sort of thing. So I agree. I mean, I think schools do have they're a somewhat controlled environment, right? There's more social control going on. There's more guardianship in a routine activities perspective. So those contexts are different, and I think while crime does occur in schools, that context probably shapes some of how it plays out, right? That's kind of how we're thinking through these differences. To me, these differences aren't necessarily between school shootings and public shootings pronounced enough to say, oh, school gun violence is completely unique from community gun violence in like a really fundamental way. Um, there are these differences, and they're important to keep in mind when we're thinking about prevention and intervention. Um, but it isn't. Like if we think back to the stereotypes of rampage shooters, um, uh, you know, lone actor, disgruntled white boy in a suburban school, really the only stereotype that is supported among the school shootings in our sample is lone perpetrators, just that they acted alone. And like you said, I'm looking at completed school shootings, and so maybe the ones that did occur in groups, they were disrupted before, and there was never a report to police made. So yeah, so there's a couple things we don't know all of these little details per se from our data. That's the limitation of the data. It's information known to police. Um, but these are kind of how we're thinking through it, and kind of teasing out what might be going on here. Another important finding too is there's virtually no significant differences between the two types of shootings at the contextual level. Um, and I think that is, that's kind of propped up by prior research that is somewhat limited, but there have been some studies in the past that have started to look at context in school shootings, right? What kind of neighborhoods do they happen in? What kind of communities? Um, and correlates like concentrated disadvantage, residential instability, racial ethnic heterogeneity, um, didn't differentiate between. So that kind of implies that school gun violence is happening in the same kinds of places that community gun violence is also happening. which is again somewhat challenging that fundamental assumption or that stereotype about rampage shootings. So I think that was another key finding of our study, was having that extra level in there.
Yeah, and I mean that supports other research findings because
Mhm.
I wrote a paper about Jan Sludzwik's concept of unforgiving places, and that's that within very similar communities there are different rates of gun violence based on a number of social factors. And I did a study of looking at schools that have had multiple shootings on campus,
Mm.
and when you think there are only 3,400 incidents that I've recorded, it's incredible that there are schools that have had two, three, four, even five shootings on the same school campus.
Right.
And when you follow the characteristics of unforgiving places and you look at by zip code the demographics and poverty rate uh, within those schools, it's the most disadvantaged places in the country that disproportionately have the highest rates of gun violence and repeated gun violence. What I really liked about this paper, and it drives me crazy in a lot of academic literature, that you'll have all of this detail about the methods, data, and analysis, and then there's 2 3-line paragraphs at the bottom with the implications and the areas for future research. You have 3 pages of
Mhm.
implications for research and policy. I think many of these are very important. Can you talk through what kind of some of the biggest policy implications are that you drew from this?
Definitely. So kind of to start, I was thinking already about what we have. And I'm not a, I study school shootings, mass shootings, offenders, victims, incidents. I'm not going to pretend to be like an expert on um, school security policies per se. Like I know enough from doing this research, but that isn't my primary area. So there's definitely people out there more knowledgeable than me about that. But I think about what we already have, and a lot of our existing school safety policies, at least the ones that get a lot of attention in the news and you know, that schools will promote to show that they're taking steps to be safe, um, are geared toward preventing rampage school shootings, which is important, and we should prevent them, right? Not arguing that we shouldn't by any means. However, when you think about what those typically are, metal detectors, I mean, people talk about like see through backpacks. The question becomes, if there's school gun violence that's happening in the parking lot, at the entrance of the building, on the corner of campus, if it's happening between individuals that aren't students, but they're, you know, coming to a football game and then getting into an argument, and then um, that escalates to where one male shoots another male.
Or misses and hits 2 students in the bleachers?
Right, exactly. Those sorts of incidents, it's questionable to assume that some of the things that we've developed to prevent rampage school shootings will have an effect on those. So the way that I was thinking of it was, okay, if there is some truth to this notion that school gun violence is community gun violence that might be kind of permeating the school context in one way or another in various fashions, we might also need to consider addressing um, social problems in neighborhoods or in communities. And so I think in the paper, I talk a little bit about, like gang outreach programs or kind of the youth outreach for street youth. This would be more in urban contexts, probably. I think that that's something that we need to consider as a school gun violence prevention method, and not necessarily treat the school as separate from the community, or as separate as we maybe have in the past.
And there's
Um,
strong evidence supporting those programs. And, on their
mhm,
face, somebody might think it's shocking, but, what you do is, you find maybe a 20 to 22-year-old who's just been released from incarceration, who'd committed, gang related shootings or violent crime or so
mhm,
on. So they have the street credibility, but they've been reformed by the criminal justice system. And
mhm,
you put that person into a school as a violence interrupter because
mhm.
those 15 and 16 and 17-year-old kids that have an issue with each other or habitually carrying guns. They're not interested in talking to an adult. They're not interested in talking to a police officer, but that 21-year-old who's covered in tattoos, who just got out of prison, is somebody that they will listen to. So those community-based violent interruption programs happen, and they can either happen for no cost or a fraction of the cost of having a school police officer.
And when you think about causes, like or theoretical perspectives that explain why we have community-based violence, you think about like cultural codes, for example, like those kind of unspoken rules that dictate when violence is permissible, when it's okay to use violence as a conflict resolution tool. Um, a metal detector isn't necessarily going to address it. It's going to potentially detect a weapon and allow someone at the front of the school to confiscate it, or it's not that it doesn't have any utility, but it's not necessarily going to get at, like you said, like a violence interrupter can try to socialize youth. This isn't how you solve conflict. This isn't how you cope with stress and strain. And so I think 100%, right? And I think that I don't think that those types of policies are necessarily what comes to mind, though, when we think school shootings, right? Maybe school gun violence broadly, or maybe community violence, but not necessarily. And I think that some of those interventions, I mean, we also talk about counseling and social workers and, addressing stress in the family context that students are bringing with them to school. And, there's a lot of different avenues, but I think that those policies would not only potentially prevent or help intervene in school gun violence, but also school violence generally, right? Like just students getting in fights with each other, getting in fights with teachers. I think that we can
who's going to
have.
get in a fight? What 15-year-old is going to get in a fight in a hallway if they know a 21-year-old covered in tattoos who just got out of prison is also walking around in the hallway there to break up the fight? So
Right.
yeah, it's thinking out of the box on a lot of these things. And to your point about the physical security systems, those combined with zero tolerance policies, I believe can actually have a negative effect on your kind of broader community gun violence prevention. Because if every student feels targeted, every student, students hate having clear backpacks. Students hate waiting for half an hour in the rain and cold to go through a metal detector line when they're just trying to go into school. A student whose friend, is a habitual gun carrier, but it's their friend, they don't want to turn that friend in if there's a zero tolerance policy and they know they're going to be expelled and have a criminal referral for that. So some of these things that have already very questionable effectiveness in preventing a rampage school shooting may actually have a negative effect in preventing a systemic gun violence on school campuses, because you're taking away trust. You're taking away the incentives for somebody to talk, because you're creating this entire structure that separates the student from the institution.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, and there's tons of writings on, right, like school criminalization, how some of these measures are disproportionately affecting students of color and LGBT Q plus youth in schools in negative ways, right? And I mean, you get into false positives, labeling effects, which there's a number of potentially negative side effects or consequences. And so I think when we do think about, or when schools do consider prevention, intervention, what that looks like, I'm not necessarily saying you can never have a metal detector, but I think that the way that it's approached needs to be very thoughtful, right? Rather than kind of driven by, and I understand how it can be driven by fear and it can be driven by desperation, and we need to do something right now, and we need to have something in place to make students and parents and teachers feel better. 100%. I understand school administrators have to deal with a lot of different opinions and interests. But I think some of it is kind of, I think, at more of a micro level, I think that an individual school could also think about, okay, what kind of violence or crime are we having in our school district? And that's going to look different if you're a rural school. Like I grew up in a town of 2,000 in Wisconsin. We did have crime in the school, but it's probably far less frequent, and it probably looks very different than a school in the middle of St. Paul, Minnesota, which is, capital city, bigger, more urban area. And so some of it might be kind of tailoring, seeing what your crime problems are, but being mindful of the consequences and being mindful of what that impact will have on students and teachers and school culture as well, right? Um, I can see where people like more of the outreach and interventionist um, professionals could help actually um, like strengthen a school's culture around safety and violence prevention. So, but I think that's kind of my approach to it, is taking more of a holistic approach that looks beyond even the school context, trying to address things at school. Another thing to point out too is you see those minimal differences. I couldn't control for, NIBRS doesn't have like a mental health variable, but when you look at the school or the youth violence literature, and then you look at the school shooting literature, even rampage school shootings, youth that engage in violence, going back to the literature in the 90s, mental illness is a correlate that often is talked about, not necessarily as a cause, but as a correlate. They talk about
And how
broken
do you
family.
define mental illness too? Is diagnosed depression versus
Right.
paranoid schizophrenia are very different.
Right, exactly. And right now I think the prevalence rates for like the lifetime prevalence rates for mental illness is like 1 in 2 people in their life will meet criteria for a so right, like that's a whole other consideration, is not a like sole cause, but a lot of the correlates are somewhat similar. When you look at the case studies of school shootings, whether they be single victim school shootings or rampage shootings, often they're not youth that come, like they have trauma, right? They have histories of trauma, um, that kind of mirrors youth that engage in violence in more urban contexts or street contexts, also have trauma, also have family issues. um, so there are commonalities in both. They aren't necessarily as starkly different as maybe conceptualized in some ways. um,
Well,
so
when these non-fatal incidents that you captured are usually not pre-planned.
Mhm.
Somebody wasn't planning to shoot somebody that day. The fight happened and they carry a gun, and then the fight
Mhm.
turned into a shooting or even a robbery where
Mhm.
you didn't plan to shoot somebody during the robbery, but when something went wrong or somebody panicked, all of a sudden a shot is fired. It speaks to an experience of trauma and fear if a teenage kid decides that they need to carry a gun with them to their
Mhm.
school every day. And that might not be the same trauma and fear of a white kid in a suburban or a rural school who feels social isolation and feels bullying or feels nihilism, and they commit their pre-planned school shooting. A kid who is scared of being victimized or being shot on their way to and from school, in their time after school, in their home, in the evening and night, and that drives them to think their only solution to protect themselves is to habitually carry a handgun too. That's speaking
Mhm.
to kind of this broader kind of social circumstance trauma.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's something that, being, again, me being from a rural area, um, and then moving to the Twin Cities in Minnesota when I was 18 for college, I didn't really have perspective on that, right? When I graduated undergrad, I was a probation officer in Hennepin County, the county that covers Minneapolis. I did that for 2 years in between undergrad and grad school. And I had clients that were, I worked with adults, but I had clients who were, they would stash their gun in a bush outside the jail. My office was in the jail, so that's where they'd have to come in and see me. But they would stash their gun, meet with me because they had to go through a metal detector, meet with me, go back out, grab their gun. And they wouldn't necessarily tell me this, but this was something that I was told will happen or does happen when I started that job. And that was actually the first time I realized, okay, there are people who do not, like you said, feel safe walking to school or walking to meet with their probation officer or going to the grocery store. And so, right, it's kind of survival mechanism, right? It's how that kind of culture develops too, of needing to protect yourself. When is it permissible and when is it not? Um, these are all things that are relevant to school gun violence as well as community-based violence.
My final question for you is, based on this research, what unanswered questions do you now have, and what do you think needs further exploration?
Yeah, there's a lot. I'll be brief. So I think one question that I still have, and I think there's actually a study that recently came out, I think this year. I haven't gotten around to reading it yet, but it's on my list. Um, I think we need to do more comparisons. So I also recently published a study where I was comparing, or I was looking at definitional debates of mass shootings, and trying to kind of understand how, when you define mass shootings in different ways along different definitional criteria, how do the victim offender incident characteristics change, right? And so I think that there's an avenue of research there with school shootings as well, because we have a lot of different definitions. I'm not necessarily advocating for one definition over another. I think they all have utility in different circumstances. But I think that we need to be, I think when you look at school shooting papers, one will be brandishing to death, one will be someone has to be killed, one might be someone has to be shot, not necessarily killed, and then one might be we're only looking at mass casualty incidents. It kind of becomes an apples and oranges if we all conflate them under one term. And so I think we need to do more fine-grained comparisons of the different types of school gun violence or different forms of it. One thing that I wish I could have included in this study was, I wish we had enough lethal school shootings to compare, non-fatal public shootings, do more of like a multinomial logistic regression, which is just a fancy word of we'd have more categories, right? Look at fatalities in public versus fatalities in school, compare rampage school shooters to single victim, non-fatal, do more of those comparisons to better understand how the characteristics shift. The challenge with that is those comparisons are best if you have a data set that has all of that data, where you don't have to necessarily take two data sets, one that has community-based violence, one has school, and clean the variables to be similar enough that you can do comparisons without it becoming kind of weird in the analysis portion of it. Um, so I mean, so again, first off, I think we need more comparisons, more points of comparison. Let's better understand these different phenomena that are kind of captured under this broader categorization of either mass violence or school gun violence. I think there's also calls for better data. And I mean, I think your data set was a step in that direction, right? Of being like, I'm going to capture this wide array of incidents so that we can do those sorts of comparisons. I think we even need to go broader in some ways. And, we need to have, like, for example, with NIBRs, there at present, although I think there will be coming out eventually, there isn't like a gunshot wound category for like injury, right? There's a number of injury categories, but not one that you can isolate. Okay, this person was shot with a gun. Um,
And that's doable, because when you think about transportation data, we know the who, what, where, when, and why, and the mechanism of
mm-hmm,
death for every motor vehicle accident in the United States for decades. And we've
mm-hmm,
used that to transform motor vehicle collisions from being the highest category of accidental death to
mm-hmm,
now one that's significantly managed and continues to decrease every year. So
right.
we took that data from highways, we affected policy with it, industry made changes, and
Mm-hmm,
driving in a vehicle is safer than it's ever been at any point in history. That's largely because of data collection, mandating data collection, and having standardized ways to analyze that information. We have not done
mm-hmm,
that for gun violence, largely because the gun industry, which is $1 billion industry, has blocked almost all research on this at the government level, where you would collect that data back to the
mm-hmm.
1990s.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's why, it's maybe wishful thinking, but in an ideal world to me, we would have, a national level official data set that collects information on all gun violence incidents where we could more easily isolate, these different um, types of violence and compare them and better understand them. And um, yeah, I think another point of comparison too, that I can kind of end on, is uh, looking at also, I mean, are there differences between K through 12 and college and university shootings? I don't know. There's been a few rampage shootings that at
Well,
college.
luckily, that's a new violence prevention project data set.
Oh,
Is
really?
we created? There's now a higher ed homicide
Mm,
database data set, and then taking the K through 12 school shooting database and using that to derive a K through 12 homicide database. So there
right.
now is a newly coded set of data that is equivalent for both K-12 and higher ed homicide incidents only.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I didn't know about that yet. Um, but I think that's especially relevant. There was a school shooting at FSU last year, and so that was something that got me thinking too about how are things similar or different between K-12 and college and university. They could be very similar, but college and university, the context of the space is different too. It's not as highly controlled in terms of students have to be in their chairs when the bell rings. There's probably in some ways more security, in some ways less. So,
Students who are
um,
adults who can legally buy guns, as we saw at Rollins College in Central Florida this week, where a
mhm,
student was arrested with an AR-15 in his dorm room when he
mhm,
ordered 1,500 rounds of ammo to be delivered to the campus,
right.
neither of which violated any state laws,
Mhm,
um, but it violated the university's policies. So, yeah, I've never really tried to get into understanding shootings at higher ed because it's infinitely more complicated with the people involved, the spaces involved, the number of students, the breadth of campuses that you have extension buildings, you have privately owned buildings, you have students living
mhm,
in private and public buildings. It is an absolute mess. But maybe we'll save that for a future episode because we have covered a tremendous amount of information here
mhm.
today. I'll have a link to the paper in the show notes. Kyle Knapp is in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University, where he is a PhD candidate. And from everything we covered today, I do not think that this will be the last time that Kyle and I talk, because I think there's a lot of other research and findings and ways to analyze this information that we need to talk about in this format and hopefully share with everybody who's interested. So, Kyle, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk again.
Sounds good.